And we're live. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome back again to the series, What's Your Story? This week, we're thrilled to have Anikah McLaren come to us from Participant. The team from Miami will be interviewing her about her very interesting path. Anikah, we're really, again, thank you for being here, and thrilled to get to spend an hour and hear about your story. We just want to remind everybody again that this is part of our initiative, the Gather Project, a study and experiment in gathering people together who are passionate about film. Check us out at gatherproject.net. Sign up and you'll get information about shows like this and other things that we're doing. But without further ado, we're going to turn it over to the team from the University of Miami who are going to be leading the charge. Anything else?
Now let's introduce.
And Geethika and Eme and Abigail, the team, are going to be leading the charge. So with that, I'm going to mute my computer and let you guys do the talking. Go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kevin. As Kevin said, this is What's Your Story? And we're going to be talking to film professionals to get insight into the film industry. Today, we're spotlighting Anikah McLaren. She's the Executive Vice President of Narrative Film at Participant Media. She has also worked as the Senior Vice President of Production at Fox Searchlight Pictures, as well as taking on the role of Production Executive at Universal Pictures. She's worked on a wide variety of films, from Scott Pilgrim to The Bourne Legacy. So I'll be moderating the conversation today with Eme, and Abigail will be moderating the chat. So if at any point you have any questions that you want us to ask, feel free to put it in the chat, in the Q&A box. A little bit about myself. I'm a sophomore at the University of Miami. I'm majoring in poli-sci and film. And I'm going to pass it over to Eme to let her introduce herself, and we can get started.
Hi, I'm Eme. I am a junior at the University of Miami. I'm studying health science and motion pictures, and we're super, super excited to get to meet you today and ask you a bunch of questions. So to get started, our first question is, do you have a specific movie that maybe impacted you in your young adulthood or in your childhood that kind of like made you want to work in movies?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Eme. I did. It's interesting. I watched a lot of HBO as a child, as a preteen, and so I would say that it's a little embarrassing, but I really liked scary movies a lot as a kid. I still like them, but I don't watch them quite as much, and so one of my very early favorite movies, which is a classic and maybe still my favorite movie, is The Shining.
I'm not a super fan of scary movies, but I can watch that one. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, The Goosebumps was my favorite series when I was a kid, so I totally relate to the horror obsession.
Yeah, a lot of sleepovers and staying up past my bedtime. But yeah, those were my early, that was my favorite genre.
Love to hear it. Thank you. So you graduated from the George Washington University with a BA in English. And you started working in book publishing, internet websites, that sort of thing. I kind of wanted to ask you, what caused you to shift away from that sort of work, and what led you to the film industry, to where you are now? That sort of
So I definitely always watched a lot of film just as a hobby, and was a bit of a fanatic just in my youth, as I know a lot of young people, love movies and TV. And then, at some point in college, so I was also a minor in creative writing, as well. And so I always was really just loved like engaging in storytelling generally. And then I had taken a class in film and literature. And I actually had done sort of like a pre-college program where I took a film and literature class, and then I like did another one at some point at school and at George Washington. And like, I just started to kind of be interested in film more academically. And then, quite frankly, like I had always, kind of played around with if I wanted to be a writer, and then naturally just was interested in book publishing. And so at some point along the way, after I graduated and had an internship in publishing, I started to kind of learn that there was, like, you could have a job similar to being an editor of books, but to do that in film. And so it was something that happened, probably in my, mid 20s, where I started to be aware of being a film executive as an actual profession. And I had at that time, which was in the early 2000s, had sort of wanted to break out from book publishing, had felt like I was always such a book worm, and maybe that I should at least, explore something else, which is when I went to work at a website and explored sort of, production, but within the format of e-commerce. And so, so it was just something that like started to come into my ear through friends who were working in film. Being in New York, it was a fairly small industry. And so once I sort of learned about it, I just thought, I really want to try this. I love it. I haven't committed, really down one path or another. So let me give it a try. And after I did, have an internship at a small production company called Forensic Films, which is how I know Kevin and Francesca. That it was all kind of, up from there.
Awesome. So talking a little bit about your forensics film internship, we were wondering, like, how was that experience for you?
Sure. It was amazing. It definitely now, I mean, it's almost 20 years ago that I had the internship. So it was a definite, very different moment in terms of it really being still, there was no streaming, films, still had, a real, a different kind of sheen to them. And there was a really strong independent film community in New York, and Forensic Films was part of that. So it was really great for me in that I really learned it was almost like a crash course, because Forensic produced films in several different kinds of ways, and they were very hands-on, like on-set producers. They also did development, and they also really worked intensely in the logistics of making a film, so budgets, schedules. And so I just had an opportunity to work on a couple of movies very early in my career, and I just literally learned. I knew nothing when I came in about really what it takes to make a film, and I basically learned how to do that, within the year and a half or so that I worked there. So it was incredibly valuable. And as I always like recommend to people, I also had two really great bosses who were, allowed me to learn and were supportive, and, were like it was a very familial environment. And so it was, I worked really hard, and, I didn't make a lot of money, and it was like a scrappy type of thing, but, it was just immersive. So there's still things that I think about from that time at the company.
Awesome. And so talking about like your experience, was there ever a moment that you felt maybe inferior because, you were not coming from a film background? So was there any moment like that, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that, because film is, like I'm sure other industries too, has such a specific way of operating, you can easily feel like an outsider. You may not understand the lingo that people are using, or people may refer to other people at other companies, and if you're not familiar with what's, the agencies or the studios or, the networks, it can feel very intimidating. I think for me, that was part of it. But then I think also, it's because it's a fairly small community, like arts industry, it is a little bit, it's almost sometimes like college or high school where you feel like everybody who works in that industry knows each other. And so if you don't know people, you can feel, like an outsider. So that was something maybe more so than the kind of literal information about the industry that I found challenging for many years.
Awesome. And what would be like takeaways? So for students who are now doing internships and stuff like that, what would be like your advice for us to like take away from those?
From internships? I think the thing that's great about internships is it's a great opportunity to kind of to work and have a contribution, but the stakes of your work are low enough that you're kind of pressure to succeed. And what I imagine many of you guys are still going through, where it's like, what's my grade going to be? Am I, going to get into this class? How is my thesis? Like all that stuff. It's like when you start to work in the job market, that type of thinking is not as, you can be liberated from that a little bit. And so I think the great thing about internships too is you have, it's almost like you're auditing a class or something, and you can really just try to absorb everything around you. Like, how are the people who work there? Can you see what the work is of the executives who are working there? Like, are you interested? Do they seem happy? Are you enjoying what you're reading? Are there opportunities for you to, network with the other interns? So I think it's something where, when you have the opportunity to do an internship, I think it's so great because it doesn't have to be a whole year. It's a limited amount of time. You can try internships, you can have multiple internships, you can do them in different places. And, once you get into the job market and you are committed to a job, it may be years that you're at one place. And so you don't have that opportunity to kind of just sample and absorb. It's a little bit, it kind of changes. So yeah, so that's my instinct about, what's really useful about the internship.
Thank you. So continuing to speak on your early career, something that I noticed when I was looking at what you've done is you used to work as an assistant to Jane Seamus, and I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about that. There wasn't that much I could find about it, so I couldn't really ask you
all here.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know what that experience was like. You did under him.
Yes. That was definitely I think that was my last time being an assistant before I became an executive. So as I'm sure some of you know from your experience, like the assistant job is often seen as kind of an apprenticeship. So it's not, you're a secretary, and, the idea is that for people entering into the industry, that it's a good way for them to get their sea legs, and that they will eventually try to then move into whatever path they are interested in. So yeah, that was a great one because James was one. Again, I think it's something I just think is really important, is just that he was a great human being, and our interests were sort of aligned, and he was interested in supporting young people. And so that job was very demanding, I think, because he, wore a lot of hats. So he was a film professor, was a producer at the time, and then he was also co-running, you know, a mini major studio. So it was really demanding job. I worked a lot of hours. There was some travel. You know, I didn't do a lot of creative work, which I think can be hard if you're really interested in doing that. And then, you know, you find yourself in a situation where you're like, I'm booking someone's travel, or I'm, you know, arranging this person's schedule, and maybe you don't really love doing that. So, but it was very gratifying because I made a lot of relationships with other people at Focus Features who I'm still friends with today. I'm still very close with James, and he's been a mentor to me for my entire career. So it was, to me, I think, one of the more formative, you know, assistant relationships that I had, and being able to move out of that, still having a relationship with him, but then also feeling like I knew enough to move forward into the next job was really great.
Awesome. That's so interesting. Looking at it as more of an internship, like the internship or your job, looking at it more of like I'm learning from them rather than like I'm your secretary. Like that was a really cool insight. So before the position that you have today, you have worked in many awesome companies. So we would like to know your insight of how to navigate like working up. For example, like when did you know it was time for like to stop working as an assistant and like to move on?
Right. Okay. I have a lot of feelings about this. So I really think that it's almost like, the way I feel about jobs generally is that and people's relationship with their jobs is, it's very much like your relationships with other things and people. So, you know, sometimes if you're in a relationship or you're in a friendship that's feels like, oh, something's not working, like it usually it feels instinctive. You're like, I can tell that I need to have a conversation about this, or maybe it's time to break up, or maybe I need to move out of this roommate situation. So I really feel like a lot of similarities there. So usually, for me, and I haven't had that many executive jobs, but you start to feel like you are maybe not growing, or that there's some element of the job that is like irritating on some level, just to be blunt about it. You know, I think that there's definitely, I think when you're at the assistant level, or some of the, as we call it, the more junior levels, you know, I think because you're kind of tracking your career and you have potentially a goal of moving up, you know, I think also there's times where you just think, oh, well, there's a lot of time going by, and like, I want to progress, and I'm still an assistant. So I think at the time when I was working for James, I had been an assistant maybe for 3 years. And so there was definitely a feeling of like, you know, again, I know this is an apprenticeship, so, and I'd like to move on in the apprenticeship. And then you kind of start to think, okay, well, am I good at my job? Like, am I feeling like I kind of can do this more easily than maybe I have been able to in the past, because I've just been doing it longer? And because of that, like, am I maybe not being as challenged as I could be? So I think there's like the emotional component, which is similar to, you know, other relationships. I think there's other motivations, which is salary. Like, you know, some of the, you know, the more junior roles, like they may not pay a lot of money. Like there was a point in New York for sure when I was working for Forensic Films where I, you know, had an unpaid internship, which I don't think people do as much now, which is really positive for humanity. But, you know, I had an unpaid internship, and then I was getting paid, but it was a small amount. And so at that time, you know, you're like, okay, well, I have my rent. So you start to have like, you know, maybe some pressures that you guys have now just at school. But then once you get out of school, it's like those become potentially more. And so there's also like, am I feeling like I need to make more money? Or are there other people that I'm responsible for, and like I need to make money for them or like whatever it is. So I think there's, you know, your own personal growth, and then there's like the realities of like wanting a pay raise or feeling like you've maybe deserve a pay raise and those sorts of things that all kind of play in. But I usually feel like you get an emotional clue in some way, like whether or not you recognize what it is, that's kind of like, it's like the 7-year itch where you just feel, okay, well, you know, I feel like it's time to move on. So I just would encourage you guys to think about that, because I think sometimes there's like there's a compartmentalization of your work, but I think particularly in film too, which is arts based, it can be all encompassing, that like a lot of times it is an emotional thing as well.
So speaking to that, sort of, you spoke about like feeling like you're stagnating, or and you kind of mentioned earlier too how you were struggling to find that that medium between your creative, your artistic, and then the business and actually making that film come to life, right? I kind of wanted to ask you, like, how do you find that balance? Like, how do you, especially in the roles that you have now, like, where do you see that balance being drawn to, like, make sure that, you know, you're treating yourself and helping yourself grow artistically, but also staying realistic? Like,
I mean, I think what's great about movies is that no one movie is like another movie. Just the way that like one story is different than another story. So I feel like there's, for me at least, there's always like a basic stimulation in engaging with any movie project, because I do actually really love it. And I like the process of it. I like the, you know, most times I like the projects that I'm working on. And so that usually, in however many years it's been now, like that will carry me along. And I think usually the balance is just, you know, it's been really different at different times. You know, I think that where it's important within the job is just to try to create balance within the type of work that you're doing. So there's times where like, I'll literally be like, I've just been returning emails for 5 hours. Like, that's great. But like, maybe now I need to pause and like read a script, or I need to, you know, call this person, you know, to talk about a new project that I want to do, because I haven't done that. And so I think some of it is like finding the variety within like the context of your work. I think for me, the creative, you know, I was actually talking to a younger person in our social impact team today about this, where he was describing, he was writing a TV show, and his day job is that he works in the social change space at our company. And he was like, yeah, it's so great. I've just written this TV pilot, and like, I feel so good and energized. And I was like, that wasn't exactly the feeling I had when I was doing creative writing. It was more of like, oh, like this is good, you know, there was a different vibe. And so for me, like being able to work with other creative people is a way that I fulfill that creative desire. And then frankly, like, you know, right now, like I'll make sure that everything that I do within movies doesn't prohibit me still having that as a hobby, because it always was a hobby. So now I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to watch like a reality show. I don't work in reality TV. It's a way of like breaking, like creating a little bit of a wall of like, I can still be entertained even if I'm like creating entertainment. The one place where it has completely broken down is books. Is very difficult for me to pick up a book, because I read a lot of manuscripts for work, and to consider if they should be films. And it's just not relaxing too. It's very difficult, you know, for me to think that in my free time I'll do reading. But yeah, I think generally I can find the balance.
Yeah, a lot of my friends are in like the Frost School of Music here at the University of Miami. My suite mate literally will come to me and be like, if I look at a French horn one more time, like I need a complete break. I was like, isn't that your major? And she's like, yes, but no more.
I totally hear that.
So transitioning a little bit into your current position, I know that especially for people who don't, look into like the back end of movies, like a lot of the time especially when I'm like talking to my parents about like my classes, they'll be like, oh, so are you an actress? Are you a director? And I'm like, no. So could you speak a little bit about what a typical day at work would look like to you? It can be before COVID or during COVID, if you want to talk a little bit about both. I know that those are two completely different ball games.
Yeah. I'll talk about before COVID because I think it's more representative of like what I imagine we'll get back to some semblance of being able to talk to people in person. So yeah, I mean, usually like just on a basic level, the hours are like 9:30 to 6:30. They're kind of long hours. People in the industry do a lot of like work networking lunches. So that happens midday. And I think usually for me, it would be, you get to work and the volume of emails is quite a lot. It's sort of some combination of looking at the schedule and seeing kind of what are your priorities for the day, looking at maybe the projects that you're managing and thinking about what needs to be accomplished on those projects within the day. And then, honestly, a lot of meetings. There's meetings within, the company to plan financial planning or creative planning or something called weekend read, where everybody reads scripts over the weekend and then we talk about them. And then something that is more applicable in the pre-COVID days is a lot of meeting, directors, actors, producers, and, kind of just getting to know people and hearing pitches and, a real kind of social component to the job, which has changed dramatically. So there is, I think, my husband works in aerospace and like he basically is doing his job just like within the house. But for us, our job has morphed. Like all of the meetings we would have, I think part of it isn't even as relevant when you're doing it on a Zoom, or it feels optional, or like, if the person hasn't traveled because they're here to go to a film festival, like maybe you don't meet them. So that has really changed quite a bit. And then I would also say, just some of if there's a movie in production, monitoring the film, watching dailies, communicating with the producers who are working on your film. That's obviously a big part of the job. So there's, in terms of development, that's one thing. But then if movies are in production and post, then that kind of takes on its own rhythm.
Definitely. And talking about COVID, it has come into our life and kind of, especially for students, it has switched stuff around for us so much.
Yeah.
So our question is, how do you think we should be navigating this time for like classes as well as internship? Because like you said, sometimes classes, because we're doing it through Zoom,
right,
kind of like optional. It's like, oh well, like I can
right,
later,
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's like there's times where I become aware that I'm treating something that's optional, it shouldn't be like, and actually this week I had a meeting with a filmmaker who his movie had screened at Toronto, and it was one of the few films I had watched that I really loved. Now, I will point out that because, going to film festivals has been part of the rhythm of my world for years now. And so, and there's sort of like a calendar year of activities that happen when you're in the business, and festivals would kind of have been benchmarks. And so, I watched literally maybe 1/5 of the films that I would have seen if I had been in person, or anybody had been in person. But I did see this film, and it was one where like I almost forgot that, a natural plan would be to meet the filmmaker who had made the film because we weren't in person. And then my colleague and I were like, oh yeah, no, we should meet him. And when I did the meeting, I did think, this might not be ideal during COVID, but like we might not enjoy the meeting as much, but like the work that's actually getting done is meaningful. And we may still find out about this filmmaker's next project, and we're still building a relationship with him. It just doesn't look the same as it used to look. So I think maybe it's also just like a little bit of like a changing of the expectations. And I think also, for you guys too, it's like the industry is like, time is ticking, the industry is moving forward, and it's morphing and changing in a very dramatic way right now. It always morphs and changes because that's just the way of life. But I think if you maybe can embrace the change, think about too, like that there's probably things and changes that are happening in your curriculum and in your school that will continue on, but that also some things will go back to the way they were. And and again, maybe if there's a feeling of like, oh, maybe I don't want to do this, like sometimes cutting yourself a break, but then also just kind of just knowing that like, maybe if you do it or you remember why you love to do it, or you were engaged before, you can still like try to do that now, which, again, you're not going to be successful every day in like getting yourself there. But I definitely had that moment this week where I was like, yes, I love meeting filmmakers. I don't want to never meet filmmakers now because I'm like stuck at home in front of my computer. So let's just remember to continue to do that.
Yeah. So my next question is shifting gears just a little bit, but Eme brought up the classes that we're taking right now, and I can say I go to a fairly diverse school, University of Miami. We're in Miami, like there's a lot of different types of people here, but University of Miami is still a predominantly white university. And I can speak to my own experience as a person of color. Sometimes in my film classes, I am the only person who looks like me. And when I was talking to the other girls in like the Gather project, one of them brought up how just as a woman in general, like in a male dominated field, sometimes she feels like she looks down upon. And those can be really isolating incidences where you feel like, you being the only one just doesn't always feel great. So I kind of wanted to know if you had any advice for how to navigate those feelings, how to really ground yourself.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, no, I'm glad you shared that. I think that honestly, like one is like just recognizing when you feel that way and just being like, okay, like I'm not going to dismiss it. Like I'm just like feeling it. It maybe doesn't feel great, but like it just is what it is. Meaning your feelings. And then I think it's, I do really believe that in an increasing way, like if you're not comfortable in an environment, like looking at like why it is that you feel uncomfortable, like some of it may literally just be like, you're just the only one. And you're like, okay, well, I don't, which as I'm sure you can appreciate has happened to me quite a bit in my career, like both being Black, but also being a woman, it's like, it's like a horrible smorgasbord of like, those experiences. But I think that honestly, it's really about being in tune with yourself. And I think if you are not comfortable and you really feel like there's something going on that is not appropriate, and that's why you're feeling uncomfortable, it's very difficult to do sometimes in the moment because it feels like you're, everybody wants to keep their job, or everybody, you want to be successful. But I do think that, if you are feeling a certain way, it's kind of, either you need to take yourself out of the situation and think about, almost like what I was saying with, some of my early bosses, where it was like, I just had such a good thing with them generally. There were other bosses where I was like, this person, like, I'm not vibing with them. Like, maybe they don't really care about my career, or they've done things that like, I wouldn't want to be treated that way. And so I think it's like, just when you feel that, trying to kind of think of an exit plan And that could be communicating to somebody that is responsible for the company or the system and, you know, telling them what's going on. And that sometimes is just like, you know, you kind of figuring out how to navigate it with integrity, like with yourself, which is really where the line, I think that's where it's really blurry. And I do think like talking to other friends and peers about like how they're dealing with it. I've done that for my whole career. And again, from people that I've known now for 15 years where, you know, we've been, each one of us has been the one Black person at our studio, and, you know, you would meet and just be like, yeah, like, this is crazy. You know, this happened to me this week, or that happened to me this week. And honestly, like that type of network, and even here at the Gather Project, like having a community that's supporting you is really helpful. Because I think like your own community, however it looks, is going to give you something different than like, you know, like work or, you know, like an outside influence. So it's kind of, it's really tricky. And, you know, I'm sure I'm just like scratching the surface, but I really do think it's about, you know, really like not being hard on yourself about like your own feelings and being able to articulate what's going on, analyze what's going on, and have people in some form or fashion to help you navigate it.
That was so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. So switching gears a little bit here, we want to ask you questions about the industry, especially with everything going on right now. What are your thoughts on the representation in Hollywood? Do you feel like it's improving? Do you feel like it's complicated?
It's definitely complicated. It's definitely improving. It's not going backwards. I don't feel like things are going backwards. I think it's really, I think what's happening now is like, unfortunately, Hollywood is like, as an institution, is a little bit just on the ropes generally, because you have the technology companies that are coming in and making things that traditionally were just made by, you know, Paramount and all the studio system. So there's kind of a power thing going on there in a big way, which COVID has made happen faster. Accelerated, that's the word. It's like, I know there's a word there. What is that word? And so I think with the representation, the current events of this past year are just doing a very similar thing. So there's sort of a feeling that, you know, Hollywood, like other industries, is being held accountable for their practices. And so it's a little bit like the Me Too movement, where there was sort of like a watershed moment where there had been, you know, abuse and abuse of power, sexual abuse happening for years, pretty much in secret, like an open secret kind of way. And then there was this defining moment of truth where it was like, oh, that doesn't seem like people, that's been outed in a way that is destroying the systems that allowed that kind of abuse to happen. So I think with racism in Hollywood, like it's kind of similar with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. I mean, unfortunately, I think it's accelerating things for only maybe for the Black community and not for other marginalized communities as much. So that's another thing. But I do think that there's just like, sometimes I feel like what happens in the world, like Hollywood's always been like, they're just behind. Like it's like a retro, you know, ways that you think you're like, who really, like Boys Club, like I didn't think this existed anymore. And you're like, well, it actually really does, you know, and so I think it's in a place where like, if the foot isn't still on the gas, it won't really be meaningful, but I feel really confident because there's sort of like a demand, at least from certain really loud segments of the public, you know, for equality in the industry, on camera, off camera. And so if those voices continue to push forward, and unfortunately, if, you know, the sociopolitics of our country like remain what they are, I just think it's like, it's just going to force some change. But I also think it's going to take longer than we think. I just don't, it's just, you know, I think it's like race, it's basically asking like racism to like not exist in a place where there's racism. So it's not going to not exist in Hollywood when it exists in the country.
Yeah, I can definitely see that on my social media like feeds. I remember when these movements were first starting up, there was a huge uproar, you know, lots of support for the movement. And especially in these past few weeks, you can see it kind of like faltering a little, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that people, when they have a cause like something like this, like it's a call to action, you know, and that'll affect every single field from, as you mentioned, politics all the way down to Hollywood. And you mentioned this a little bit about representation off screen, but I kind of wanted to delve a little bit more into that. So we know diversity on screen is super important. Like, we definitely want people to see people who look like themselves. But I especially think a lot of movies, the first example that comes to mind is Green Book, because yes, it was a diverse movie and it you know, had people of color in an important role, but for a story to be really authentic, diversity behind the screen is just as important. So can you talk a little bit about how you've seen representation, you know, in production and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So that I think is, you know, again, it's like when it's not, like, I guess representation when it's not on camera feels like it's like hidden from the public, because like you may see someone's name in a credit and you're like, I don't know who that, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't hit you in the same way. So I think there's now a lot of action happening around that. You know, to the extent that it will create change. There was, you know, the Academy kind of came out with their requirements about what's needed to, you know, allow the Best Picture, to allow a movie to be to qualify, you know. But I kind of feel that, you know, the progress is harder in some ways now, because I don't think like movies specifically are also drawing the same, you know, are as like, you know, you're going to get every great candidate who just naturally wants to be in movies. It's like, they may want to be in TV, they may want to be in video games, they may want to, you know, be. So I think where the movements are happening a lot now are to support and promote people already working in the business. It's something that I feel really strongly about, because I think the other thing that happens with representation, like in executive ranks or companies and producers and things like that, is people, if there's not a path for them to succeed, they will leave. So there's kind of this retention, like, you know, it's not enough to hire someone as your assistant. Like, you need to also help them grow, which is where like the sense of community, I think, is really important. So I think really you know, it's probably the representation behind the camera is worse than you may imagine it is. I think particularly in certain really specific like craft, you know, crew members, like I think editors, like editorial union is not good. You know, there's just a lot of issues there. And so I think, you know, as much as you may want to fix those immediately, it's just going to take time. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but that's like a further reflection, I guess.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy how like everything that you're saying is really leading into what I wanted to ask you next.
Okay.
you talked a little bit about, you can't just bring people on as assistants and then
Yeah.
stay there, right? Like, my next question to you was about tokenism, about how a lot of positions are opened up to minority populations. Like, oh, we want a person of color in our company, so come on, intern for us. Give us that diversity quota, and a lot of stories that I've heard from people who've been in those positions, or friend of friends who've been in those positions, they feel like as soon as that position is over, they don't know where to go, and it goes back to that whole, like, I guess I was just used as a token just to say that they were, and I kind of wanted to hear, like, how can we avoid that? How can we stray away from that and really keep people interested in the field?
That is something that I think is like, has been a huge problem. So it's interesting to hear that that's like still something you're hearing about in your own community. I think one, it is important to know when you're going into a position and to ask really clearly, like, what's the expectation of, like, how does it work with your promotions? Like, find out if the role, because it is true, there's been certain roles where it's like, this is we are designating this position from like a corporate level to be like a diversity hire. I don't know how much this certainly was happening and happened to me when I was earlier, like in one of my first jobs. And so it was very strange where, like, I didn't kind of know exactly what was happening. And then I was like, oh, like, clearly this is like a real position, but it's like not a real position. And I was very uncomfortable about that. And so at one point in the it wasn't a true negotiation, but in my conversation about coming onto the job, I was like, no, I need to have like a title that is like a standard title. It can't be a different title, because otherwise it's not like that doesn't make sense. So I think one is just like, when you get into a job, like, just try to make sure you really know everything about that. And if you feel like it's, I think one, you then need to decide if you're up for what that can mean, which is that someone may be invested in you, or they're maybe not that invested. Like, it's very difficult. And that can be true, like, no matter what color you are, it's just like that kind of comfort level with who you're working with. But I also think it's, I kind of go both ways with this, where I'm like, I'm all for programs that are like supporting diversity, like, because I'm not convinced that people will like do it on their own. But I also think, like, you don't want to be like tracked in a program necessarily without a way of being fed into the main system. And so I think also, honestly, like, a lot of people would never say this to anybody directly, even if they feel, I certainly didn't, but I think if you do say that, and you're like, there is a scenario of, hey, like, I, have heard, or, I know you have an initiative for more diverse executives, but like, I just want to make sure, I'm here to be a business leader. So, how does that work? And just really kind of calling people out, frankly, and holding them accountable. I for sure believe in that. Again, not because I've done it so much, but because, like, I haven't done it, and I'm like, I think actually it could be helpful. And know that it's more, that kind of thing is more important earlier in your career. And then I think you can say, like, maybe you're not interested in doing that. Maybe you hear the person answers your question and it's a hard decision, and you're like, I remember at Universal, there was a position where I had heard, it was at Fox, where, like, I had heard that there was like a CE position where, like, people would just go in there and be CEs and never be promoted out of being a CE. And it was sort of like an open secret that it was just like, people, there was no traction for them. They weren't on a path to be promoted. It just would mean that they would leave and another CE would come in. And I think also the other thing you can ask yourself is like, if you're okay with that, like that could be okay too. A lot of the people who were CEs there have gone on to do great things. They just didn't do that in the company. So I think there's a number of different ways. But I think it's like, that is a situation where, knowledge is really power. And if you don't know how you're being thought of, or people aren't being totally straightforward with you, that's where it can get tricky, because you can't be you don't know how to maneuver unless you really have the information. So my hope is that, like, when you guys are really out there, like, this will be irrelevant because it's bad, and like I think it's really destructive on so many levels. But I just, don't know if that will be the case.
Yeah.
And find mentors. Sorry, that's the other thing. Mentors.
That's really beautiful, especially like encouraging us to find mentors and things like that. And I think that falls really nice with with something that we found out, that you work with AFI Directors Workshop for Women.
Yes.
So we would love to know a little more about the program, as well as like what your role is in it.
Sure. That I have not been doing too much with that in like the past year. The program, the AFI Directors Workshop for Women is a great program. And it's really a program that's designed to have filmmakers kind of matriculating and making a short film over the course of their workshop. And so basically there's probably, I don't know how many of us there are, but there's basically a pool of us who will kind of help curate like who's going to be in the workshop, or like, meaning like we will sometimes provide referrals, or like it'll be like, hey, does anybody know, a candidate for this? So helping to sort of like get people into the workshop. And then, the way that program is structured with the executives is really, there's like a series of maybe 2 or 3 meetings. It's not like a high touch type of program for the exec committee, but where we meet with the directors and we kind of counsel them on like, what do they want to do in the business? Like, can we help them with our, in terms of putting them in touch with people who can help further their career? Do we have comments on their short, are there creative things that we can be helping out with? So, but really the goal is to help bridge the gap between like, I have a short, I've been, studied at AFI, and now I'm going to go get hired on a film. And again, it's like, that's where I think it can be like an assistant job. It's a little bit different in the creative side, where there's, you may have the credentials and the work, but then you have to make a leap into actually getting paid, on like, a legit job, or getting your film financed and made.
Yeah, and I think that was that's a really awesome program. It sounds super interesting.
AFI is, I think AFI I think is great because you really actually like learn how to make things. And I also really am a fan of the Project Involve program at Film Independent for a similar reason, where I feel like you actually, like, it's not film school, but like AFI is, but like, it's not, it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge program, but you can come in for a year, participate in a certain kind of training and really get exposed.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions we have for you tonight. Thank you so much for being here, for answering all our questions, for giving us such great insight. I think I need to rewatch all of this and like try to take everything. This was great.
I don't know. Okay.
Awesome.
Hey guys, Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Geethika. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to remind everyone that all of the links to what we talked about, like the info, there's a bunch of links in the chat, so be sure to check that out. And I wanted to thank Anikah one last time. I know that I gained a lot of really valuable advice from you, so thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. This was really fun.
Thank you. Yeah, officially pass it off to Kevin. Sorry.
No, that was great. Anikah, again, thanks so much for doing this. It's really amazing and so informative. I just say to everybody out there too, we'll have this recording up. You know, if you have friends who weren't able to make it, they want to check it out, you can go to our website, gatherproject.net, sign up, take a look at the links to our YouTube page, and also look out for the newsletter where we'll do a quick recap of this as well. So again, gatherproject.net. But anyway, thanks. Happy Friday, Anikah. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you guys. Be safe out there.
Yeah, we'll catch up again soon. And
Okay.
thanks everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye,
Great
guys.
job.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.